Hi there, this is Dr. Anna Maria Helt here with Basmati.com, and we're going to do recording number 2 of Chanterelles this week. I seem to be having technical difficulties today, and Milo in the background, other than being cute, hasn't been much help. So this week we are going to, in fact, get into a mushroom, one of my favorite wild mushrooms, chanterelles, and probably one of the most popular wild mushrooms to harvest. Chanterelles is the botanical name, Canterellus, and there are a variety of different species of this mushroom that grow around North America and parts of Europe and elsewhere. Here in the southern Rockies, they like to show up after the monsoons start, so we'll usually see chanterelles here in the high country in July and August, although we've had such a weird year this year. I have no idea when they're going to show up. Where I first learned to harvest chanterelles in Washington State, our chanterelle season was in the fall, and in California it was also at a different time of year. So everywhere I've lived that's had chanterelles, the season has been a little bit different in the timing. Now, like all edible and medicinal mushrooms, chanterelles are anti-inflammatory, so they're useful for bringing down chronic systemic inflammation in the body, which is a driving factor in things like arthritis and aches and pains, as well as a bunch of chronic issues that people deal with. Chanterelles are also strongly antioxidant, as are many mushrooms, and chanterelles in particular, because they're so high in beta-carotene, that yellow-orangish pigment. They're quite antioxidants. Like all edible and medicinal mushrooms as well, chanterelles have impacts on the immune system. Mushrooms in general modulate the immune system in some way, shape, or form. Some are helpful with allergies. Some strengthen a weak immune system in people that have a predisposition for colds and flus. Some may even be useful for various autoimmune-related issues, but you want to work with somebody on that. And all mushrooms tested so far, including chanterelles, even have activity against cancer cells, at least in a dish in tissue culture. And whether that's relevant to what's going on in a person, don't know at this point for chanterelles, but it is hopeful. Now, chanterelles do have a long history of use, not just as food, but also as medicine. And so in traditional Chinese medicine, chanterelles were used for issues related to eye health, for wounds, for dry skin and dry mucous membrane, so it's a moistening, yin building, botanical in that regard. For abscesses. So abscesses are bacterial infections that are under the skin. You can get an abscess tooth, for instance. You can get an abscess after, say, a cat scratch that you don't take care of. They can be really painful. And so, interestingly, on a completely different continent in Eastern Europe, chanterelles were also traditionally used for wounds and abscesses, along with swollen glands. And this speaks to the known antibacterial effects that chanterelles have in studies. And in fact, chanterelle extracts were as effective as first-line antibiotics against such pathogenic bacteria as Bacillus species and Enterococcus species. Chanterelles are also antifungal, so don't ever let anybody tell you you shouldn't eat mushrooms when you have candida overgrowth. If you do in fact have candida overgrowth, mushrooms are antifungal, and so mushrooms are just fine to eat if you do have yeast overgrowth. And so we know that chanterelles are active against candida, and they're also active against a nasty form, or a potentially nasty form of fungus known as aspergillus. Now, in terms of medicine, chanterelles are also beneficial for the heart, and research finds that chanterelles possess ACE inhibitor activity. Now, ACE inhibitors are a common category of farm drugs that are used for high blood pressure, but a lot of mushrooms actually have ACE inhibitor activity as well, and chanterelles are one of them. Chanterelles also protect against oxygen deprivation to some extent. I mean, to be honest, if you go without oxygen for too long, you're dead. But there is some research suggesting that chanterelles can actually help to some extent with hypoxia. And that might be useful for mountain climbers, people that spend a lot of time at really high elevation. Eat your chanterelles. Chanterelles, in terms of the heart, cardioprotective activity. So chanterelles help protect the heart from damage. And I would argue that the high beta carotene content, this high pigment content in chanterelles, is also going to be beneficial to the health of our blood vessels. Generally, healthy, highly pigmented foods are good for our blood vessels, helping them to be strong but also flexible and not overly brittle. Now, chanterelles, at least so far, based on the research of all of the edible mushrooms tested, have the highest levels of vitamins B1, B2, and B6. Chanterelles have the highest level, or one of the highest levels of beta carotene that I've already talked about, of vitamin C, of vitamin D2, and vitamin E. So this is a little nutritional powerhouse of a mushroom. Maybe not so little, depending on what state you're gathering your chanterelles. Something that's really interesting about chanterelles is they're very high in vitamin B12. In fact, the RDA of B12 is about 2.6 micrograms, if I'm remembering that correctly. 100 grams of dried chanterelles by weight, 100 grams, that is a weight. 100 grams of dry chanterelles has anywhere from about 1 to 2.7 micrograms of vitamin B12. Again, the RDA is 2.6 micrograms. So if you have a good batch of chanterelles, you're getting your daily requirement of B12. So that might be something useful, especially for vegans and vegetarians who have a hard time maybe getting B12 in through their food. Although chanterelles are not going to be the cheapest source of B12 if you're buying them in the market. Of course, they're going to be less expensive if you're wild harvesting them. Although I would have to say you want to pay attention to the chanterelle populations in your area because they've gotten to be such a popular wild mushroom for harvesting. Some areas are getting over-harvested. So if you are a gatherer, maintain your patch. Don't harvest everything that you find there. Leave some of those fruiting bodies there, the mushrooms, so that they can shed their spores. Maybe skip years going to your patch and really take care of that patch. It's taking care of you. And don't share it with other people. Now, chanterelle mushrooms also have nervous system benefits. They protect nerve cells from damage and may be useful for anxiety. Chanterelles are also anti-mutagenic, and what that means is they protect DNA, they protect our chromosomes from damage, and so that damage can cause mutations, and mutations can cause problems. They are one of the driving factors, for instance, behind cancer, chromosomal mutations. So chanterelles have a protective effect on DNA, on our chromosomes. And they also may have some benefits for blood sugar regulation, as do many mushrooms. Part of that comes from the fiber contained in mushrooms, but in the case of chanterelles specifically, they have a component that inhibits a starch-digesting enzyme. So enzymes that break down starch turn those starches into simple sugars. And so one of those enzymes is called alpha-glucosidase, and chanterelle inhibits that enzyme, at least in a test tube. So this may be one potential way chanterelles have benefits on healthy blood sugar regulation in the body, though, by slowing down the production of sugars from starch. And so I think I will leave it at that. A lot of stuff that you may not have known about this delicious mushroom. One last thing on cooking them. For those of you who have heard me talk about cooking mushrooms, I often talk about dry sautéing your mushrooms first so that they have better flavor. This isn't necessary with chanterelles. You can actually just brush off the forest duff, the dirt, and throw them in a pan with some ghee or whatever you like to cook them in, maybe a little bit of salt and pepper, and you're good to go. You don't really have to do a lot to them to make them taste better because they're already delicious. And until next time, from Milo and I, be well.